Greetings, people of the interwebs, Jake here. So last night I saw War of the Rohirrim, and let me start off by saying this. So I've seen a lot of reviews, both from movie critics on YouTube and just reviews online and stuff like that, where a lot of people one of the first things that they say is that it's not as good as Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I feel like that's, one, it's kind of obvious because nothing will ever really rival any other Middle Earth tale. I don't think will ever rival the Lord of the Rings trilogy unless the Silmarillion ever got adapted and got a proper good adaptation. But I don't foresee that happening anytime in the near future, unfortunately. But I also want to say that I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to say that it's not as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When again, that was lightning in a bottle and a once in a lifetime event that will see something like that and done that well. So that's the first thing I wanted to kind of address. Is yeah, obviously it's not as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but not everything has to be like as good as that. As long as it's not Rings of Power, and I can confirm that this movie is far superior to Rings of Power in almost every way imaginable. But anyways, so those of you who aren't familiar with the story or anything like that, so basically, this movie is taken from one of the paragraphs and stuff like that in the appendices of the Return of the King. So basically, the appendices is just additional lore and information and stuff like that about Middle Earth from the beginning of time up until a little bit in the Fourth Age. So after the events of the War of the Ring. But again, Tolkien kind of just wrote little slivers, little bits of information, so nothing not a whole lot of material to work with. And basically, this story follows. It takes place, I think it's 183 years before the events of The Hobbit, which is actually one thing that has been a little bit of a in the marketing they're saying that it's almost 200 years. So I think it's 183 years before the events of The Hobbit, and I think it's 262 if I did my math right, which I could have messed up. I'm not good at math. But 262 years. Maybe I reverse that. Maybe it's 262. Anyways, so yeah, it's about 200 years before the events of the War of the Ring. Yeah, 183 years before the events of The Hobbit, and 262 before Bilbo's birthday party, which is kind of what the kind of inciting incident that kicks off the Lord of the Rings story. And basically, so takes place in Rohan, hence the name, War of the Rohirrim, where basically it's kind of not, I wouldn't quite describe it as a full-on civil war in Rohan, but it's definitely a civil conflict, because basically what initiates this, and this is what the movie starts off with, is so we're in Edoras, which is the capital of Rohan, and also want to acknowledge the fact that I love how well the animators pretty much perfectly recreated Edoras, the Meduseld, which is the king's palace in Edoras, Helm's Deep, which at the time in this time period is just called the Hornburg. So it doesn't get the name of Helm's Deep until after the events of this movie. But basically, I like the fact that they have essentially almost perfectly recreated to the tiniest details of all these scenes that we saw in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And all the more credit to the animators, because I imagine it does an incredibly grueling, tedious task to rewatch those scenes and frame by frame to be okay, how many horses are on this tapestry, or how many again, tiny little details like that. So much credit to the animators for doing that, and being able to pull it off as well as they did. But the movie starts off kind of more or less where Tolkien starts this little conflict off in the appendices, where basically a council's being held in the Meduseld of all the different lords of Rohan and King Helm. And basically, one of the lords, named Freka, is one of his less loyal bannermen, who kind of oversees like the western kind of fringes of Rohan near Dunland. And I don't recall if Tolkien confirmed it, but it's basically been heavily speculated that Freka and his family are basically of Dunlandian descent because one, they have dark hair, and basically one of the traits of the Rohirrim is pretty much all of them were blonde hair or light, very light hair, like kind of golden hair. Whereas Freka, Wolf, and a lot of their followers were all dark of hair. So, again, and they definitely stayed true to that. With Freka and Wolf, both of them have dark hair. And even the tattoos on Freka's face, there's been a lot of like fan art of like the Dunlandings, and a lot of them have like, body tattoos and stuff like that. So I like the fact that they're, again, trying to stay as faithful to a lot of like the depictions of the Dunlandings and stuff like that as possible. But basically, Freka's just kind of talking about how he proposes his son Wolf to Helm's daughter Hedda, which in the books Hera doesn't she doesn't have a name, and so that was another kind of, I guess, point of contention with some people, is they didn't like the fact that this story focused on an unnamed daughter by Helm. Not a huge deal, which I'll go a little bit more into later, but basically, so he's wanting a marriage proposal, his son Wolf to Hera, to kind of join their houses. And one thing I did like about this scene in the movie is, because basically Freka's kind of expressing his, how he doesn't really like where Rohan is right now, because he kind of says that like we're basically Gondor's lapdog, and kind of too subservient to Gondor, and instead of like sending his daughter off to marry some Gondorian, he's like, we can join our houses together and truly unite Rohan. And so I do like the fact that they touch a little bit on like some of the geopolitics of like Middle Earth at this point. And again, and I don't recall if that was like Freka's logic in the lore as well, or if it was more just him being very ambitious. But either way, that's kind of more what he was doing anyways. That was more of just like a pretense for him to kind of try to win, get the throne. But of course, Helm kind of sees through that, and he's kind of like, my dude, you're just wanting a throne. You're not really wanting to like unite all of Rohan for the sake of like good neighborliness or pride in your country or anything like that. You're a very ambitious person. You're all about like, again, the throne. And again, much like in the lore, like they have a bit of a contentious relationship where Tolkien doesn't describe a whole lot of like their background with each other. But basically, Freka kind of insults the king, calling him old, and Helm kind of dishes it right back and is like, well, you're fat. And that's kind of what initiates the conflict, is so basically these two are like, trading blows verbally before it comes to physical blows, until finally Helms is like, all right, we're going to take this outside and settle this. So of course they go outside, and Helm takes a few punches from Freka, and doesn't seem too bothered by it because he's a pretty big dude. Even I forget how old Helm's supposed to be, but I think he's like in his 60s. But he's definitely up there because he was described with like having like snow white hair, so he's pretty old, but still very physically imposing. So after like Freka just continues to dish out like punches and insults, Helm finally just one punch, and that's kind of where he gets his infamous name, Hammerhand, because after one punch, just Freka's dead. And that, of course, causes some problems because, one, tensions were already pretty high between Freka and his people and King Helm. So after, of course, he kills Freka, Wolf then, understandably, is pretty upset because he just watched his father die right in front of his face. It's like, all right, I swear vengeance upon you, and, you'll rue the day that you did this to us and our people. So Helm basically banishes him and is like, be gone, and if I see you in these lands again, like, you're dead. Because I think at that point, Helm is just kind of, he's kind of over it anyways, and also, again, you kind of got the impression that those two hadn't always had the most cordial relationships, and so Helm was just kind of like, all right, yeah, whatever, Freka's dead, let's just again, that's one problem solved. Let's just get rid of Wolf and all their people, and problem solved. So then it kind of flashes forward, and I do like that they have Miranda Otto, who played Eowyn in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, kind of like narrating this story, because it also makes sense that one, you're kind of getting some connective tissue from the Lord of the Rings trilogy to this, which is clearly set in that same universe. And again, like, Eowyn being of Rohan, telling the story of Hera and like the events of like the War of the Rohirrim, I think does make a lot of sense. So kind of flash forward a little bit. It doesn't really say the exact amount of time that's passed, but a good chunk of time has passed, and overall things seem pretty well back in Rohan, until they start to hear rumors of Southrons and Easterlings invading, because at this point in the lore, Gondor is currently basically being assaulted on like all sides, from like Corsairs in the south, Easterlings in the east, Southrons, all that jazz. So at the same time, there's also a band of Easterlings called the Varyogs who are attacking Rohan at this time, kind of just to cut off support for Gondor. And they touch on this, but I wish that they had talked a little bit more or featured this. But instead, it's kind of just like a passing line that like the Great Plague had swept through Middle Earth at this point, and had pretty much decimated like Arnor, which was the Northern Kingdom, and Eriador, and it was basically swept as far as like Northern Eriador all the way down into Northern Gondor, and just again caused devastation all across the board. And again, it's one of those things that like they briefly mention, and then that's kind of about it. And so I guess that's kind of like one of the first nitpicky things with me when I was watching this movie is, again, they kind of just gloss over that, and I wish that they had featured that a little bit more. But then after that little kind of like brief narration, Hera, Freyalof, and two characters that they created for this movie, Leaf and Olwyn, who's like a shield, kind of older, middle-aged shield maiden lady, kind of like a mentor figure to Hera. Basically, they're kind of just out riding until they see a dead body of a Southron, and basically it's been like, birds have gotten to it and picked it dry and stuff like that. And one thing that I thought was odd is, so this movie does have some contrived moments. A lot of it is just kind of there to help progress the story forward. It didn't take me out of the movie entirely, and again, like, the contrivances didn't bother me as much as other movies or shows, especially Rings of Power. I'm going to keep harping on that show because it's just bad for so many different reasons. If you want to know why, check out my reviews of why Rings of Power sucks. But anyways, so there's a bit of a contrived moment where Hera, she's inspecting the dead body, and she kind of mentions like, oh, by the way he's dressed, he seems like a Beastmaster. How she would know this, don't know. But then, sure enough, shortly after she discovers this, that's when they hear a strange noise, and sure enough, it's a Oliphant that got loose, or a Mumakil. The giant elephant things, for those of you who weren't aware with either the terms of that creature. So basically, like, the Mumakil like got loose, and it's just kind of like rampaging around, and so it kind of charges at him. Freyalof has a cool moment where he charges at the Mumakil and cuts its stomach as he's kind of riding underneath it, but falls off his horse. So Hera tries to save him, and blows the horn that the Beastmaster had to kind of like call the Oliphant towards her. So she gets on her horse and kind of like runs off and leads it away. So I think this scene was mostly there to establish that like Hera, even though she's not a warrior per se, she's there is a line in the movie where she basically says that she's like one of the fastest riders in Rohan. So I think that's the main reason for this scene, is just to emphasize that, like, okay, she's a capable rider. Maybe not like the most seasoned warrior or anything like that, but she's a capable rider. And then, so this leads into the scene that we get in the trailer, which I thought was a little concerning. So where we see, so basically she leads this Mumakil into a forest, and so as she's kind of leading it away, there's a line where Freylof is kind of like, oh, why is she leading into the forest? She knows what dwells there. And again, a nice little like foreshadow where but basically the chasing leads into the forest. And so Hera somehow knows about like this strange creature that lives in the water, and so she just chucks a spear into the water and awakens the Watcher in the water. So basically, so we don't know if it's the same Watcher in the water that we saw in the Fellowship that attacked the Fellowship right outside the mines of Moria, or if it's a similar creature. So I'm not opposed to this being like the same type of creature, because we don't know what it is exactly. Tolkien never really like explained what that was. Now it's been widely believed and speculated that's one of the Nameless Things, which are basically these creatures that dwell deep down in the depths of the earth, that are so old that even Sauron didn't know about them, that Gandalf talks about during his fight with the Balrog. And that's about all we know. So again, I'm not opposed to this being like a similar creature, but I don't know. I still didn't love, or I guess I have kind of mixed feelings about this scene. So basically, she chucks the spear at the in the water, awakens the Watcher. So then it wraps its tentacles around the Mumakil and basically drags it into the water and eats it. So it's a cool scene, and kind of reminds you of like a kaiju fight. But at the same time, I feel like this scene is also completely unnecessary and could have easily been cut, and it doesn't really change the story at all. Because that's one common complaint that I noticed with this movie is a lot of people think that it was a little bloated, a little longer than what it should have been, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. Because there are definitely some scenes I think you could have cut out or like altered to kind of improve this movie, and this is definitely one of those scenes where I feel like this was just added, I guess, to one, kind of remind fans that, like, this takes place in the same universe, that's why they added the Watcher, and, I don't know, I guess also to kind of be like, oh, hey, isn't this a cool scene? And yeah, it's cool, but it's kind of just, yeah, it's just there. So shortly after that, Hera stumbles across Targ, who was basically the kind of captain of Freken Wolf's command. So basically, he just happens to show up, and then he catches her, or kidnaps her, and then they take her to Isengard, because at the time, the Dunlendings have basically taken refuge in Isengard, and that's kind of their main camp. So that's where they've got her held up, and once Freyalof, Olwyn, and Leaf find out that she's been captured, they eventually track her down. But anyways, so basically, once she kind of wakes up, she finds out she's in a Dunlending camp, and she confronts Wolf. So it's the first time that they've seen each other in a hot minute, because again, they don't really clarify how much time has passed since the whole Helm Hammerhand situation and killing Freka, but I get the impression a good chunk of time has passed. So basically, they chat for a little bit, and, Freka's kind of like, yeah, I'm building an army, and, I seek vengeance. And he's like, but I still would like you to be queen, or be my queen, and we can end this. Like, we don't have to worry about any more bloodshed. You just take my hand in marriage, and we're solid. And so one thing that I like about this scene, and also the way that Wolf is introduced, is because I was kind of under the impression that, like, pretty much from the get-go, Wolf would just be like this, kind of like Freka, where he's kind of just an unlikable guy, very power-hungry. But that's not the impression that I got when he's first introduced. It seems like he does really like Hera, because it was stated that they were friends when they were kids. And so he did genuinely want to marry her because he liked her. But in this scene, though, after he kind of gives her the ultimatum, she says, so if I do accept your hand in marriage, will you, guarantee that you will end the bloodshed? And what I like about this scene, though, is, so Wolf just kind of like smacks her hand, and he says, if. He's like, this shouldn't be like you should just be like accepting of my hand in marriage to save your people. So I like this scene because it kind of, one, speaks to Wolf and how he has kind of grown more arrogant and prideful, and again, like, I guess in his eyes, he's asking a very simple request of her, But like, obviously, to Hera, she's not really interested in marriage or anything like that. She's kind of wants to be free to do her own thing. Um, but I like that scene just because it kind of it's showing Wolf's natural progression from where initially he started off as just probably an okay guy, not maybe not the best or anything like that, but seemed like an okay guy, and now he's going down his descent to just revenge and madness. Um, and so I do like that scene. And also, and before Wolf showed up, Hera kind of looked around the room and noticed like a map that had like troop movements and stuff like that, which comes into play later. Um, but so eventually she gets rescued, and definitely one of those movie moments where it's like, okay, so they're in an enemy camp, yet somehow like three people manage to sneak into this camp and they escape. Which one they managed to sneak into the camp without anyone noticing, which this isn't something that like this movie's guilty of. This is so many movies and TV shows where it's again it didn't take me out of the movie because it's been done so many times, and it's one of those things where you just kind of have to suspend your disbelief for the sake of accepting the movie going forward. So not a huge deal. And Freyloff gets some cool moments, even though I think it would have made more sense that like Freyloff was the one that kind of like rescued her instead of Owen, but whatever. This is me just nitpicky here. And I do like that Freyloff throughout this movie does get a decent amount of screen time, because Freyloff is basically the nephew of Helm and later becomes the king of Rohan after the series of events in this movie. Because I was kind of afraid that since Hera was the main character, she would like a lot of the other characters would kind of be like shoved to the side. And even though I still maybe would have preferred Freyloff being the main character instead of Hera, which I'll kind of go into a little bit later, kind of wrapping up this review, I do like the fact that they gave him a decent amount of stuff to do. But anyway, so yeah, once she gets rescued, they take her back to Edoras, and she kind of her and Freyloff are both telling Helm, it's like, hey, look, so Wolf's basically he's plotting. He's got a pretty sizable army, and they're heading this way. They'll be here within like a day or so. And so, of course, Helm is kind of like, no biggie, they've got a lot of troops to move. Once they get close, they'll have to rest and all that stuff, and that gives me plenty of time to, like, muster the Rohirrim. And Freyloff, being very logical, is kind of like, hey, so, yeah, but I think there's more to it than this. Like, the Moon and Kill, we think there's some kind of connection, and even though Freyloff him and Hera are both being very logical and just kind of advising the king, Helm is a very headstrong, stubborn person, so he's kind of like, shut up. I'm a king, I've fought in battles, you haven't, so I'm not having it. Because again, that's the thing with Helm is, even in like what little is written about him, is he was definitely a flawed person. Like, he wasn't like a very in comparison to like Theoden, a very just, very honorable man. Helm seemed kind of like a dick. So yeah, Helm is very much just kind of like, guys, I got this. Like, me and the boys, we're gonna handle it, no problem. And also, like, I saw some people criticize the like Helm kind of like snaps at Freyloff, and I don't think that's necessarily like it's a valid criticism, but I guess from the perspective that I was viewing this, where Helm is basically kind of snapping at Freyloff, where he's kind of like, hey, look, you couldn't even keep my daughter safe. That was the one thing you were tasked to do, is keep her safe. She got kidnapped. And yet, even though he brought her home safely, I can still understand, I imagine, from a concerned parent's perspective, where they're kind of like, well, you screwed up once, how can I trust you to, keep her safe again? And so, kind of like in this heated moment, he kind of dismisses Freyloff. He's like, all right, go to Dunharrow, and, I don't want to see you anymore. But Freyloff, being the good, loyal, not only nephew, but also servant, he's just kind of like, all right, hey, you've spoken, I'll obey, but if you need me, you've got my sword. So then he goes away for most of the movie, or the rest of the movie. And then, of course, shortly after this, the siege of Edoras happens, and I was really surprised at like how quickly paced a lot of this is, because I personally would have liked a little bit more build up to the confrontation between Frecken and Helm, just to see maybe a little bit more of like those two characters' backstory, and maybe a little bit more of like the tension between the two, and also would have liked a little bit more build up to the Siege of Edoras. But all of this happens in the first act. So like that's the movie. The movie starts with basically the duel, the infamous duel between Helm and Hammerhand, and a very one-sided duel, mind you. But I don't know, and a little bit more time too to spend with some of these characters like Hama and Haleth, Helm's two sons, who get a decent amount to do. But I still would have liked more. Just would have liked more time to spend with these characters. In particular, Haman and Halth, just because. So, after the Rohirrim mustered, Thorn, one of Helm's bannermen, basically was supposed to like cover one of their flanks. He doesn't show up because it turns out he was a traitor, and so they're kind of struggling in the fight with the Easterlings, while Wolf is leading a separate attack to basically ambush Edoras, which thankfully Hera was very smart and was like, okay, I feel like there's something off here, so let's just go ahead and evacuate the city while they're all fighting, because I've got a bad feeling about this. So thankfully she's able to evacuate Edoras in time, because basically as Wolf and his forces arrive, Edoras has pretty much already been like cleared of all the people. And then that's when Hera also comes across Thorn, and they have a bit of a fight. And one thing that a lot of people kind of criticized, or I guess criticized this movie before it even came out, is they were afraid that like Hera would be like this kind of girl boss where she could, she was great at everything and could beat everybody. And I don't really think she was much of a girl boss at all. Like, yeah, she maybe has a few moments, but overall, like in most of her fights, she gets her ass kicked. And understandable because, yeah, she might be, fairly talented with like, the basics of swordplay and combat and stuff like that, but she's never actually fought in a real battle. And so when she's fighting Thorn, she gets her butt kicked because this guy, he's a seasoned warrior. She's not. And when she does kill him, it's kind of by luck. And that's how a lot of her fights go throughout this movie, is a lot of it when she does win, it's kind of by sheer luck. Or later on in the kind of fight in Edoras, when she's fighting multiple people, they're the like Dunlendings who aren't as well armed or as well trained as like the Rohirrim and stuff like that. So some of them she's able to kind of like handle a little bit easier. So that didn't really bother me. But anyway, so Siege of Edoras is happening, and Halth gets a really cool moment where basically the Mumakil that kind of like broke through the gates of Edoras, he kind of pulls a Legolas where he's like climbing on top of it with his axe, basically just like hacking into its flesh while he's climbing up, takes out all the riders on top, and then basically climbs on top of his head and just chops a big old gash in its head and kills the Mumakil. And once he kills it, he stands triumphantly holding his axe in the air and is basically like, for Rohan, for our people, and then pretty brutally takes an arrow to the neck and dies. So Hera, Helm, Hama, like all see him die, and I knew that like Halth and Hama both died because I'm familiar with like the lore, but I still wasn't expecting both of them to die within like the first act. And then that's also, again, I think they got a decent amount of screen time, but I still just would have liked a little bit more. So that way, like their deaths were were a bit more impactful for me personally. But again, I still like the fact that like Halth, he went up like a champ, and then of course, Helm trying to like make his way back into the city takes a few arrows, so like he's pretty wounded. So they eventually just have to like flee. They gotta cut their losses and flee to Helm's Deep. So on their way fleeing from Edoras, Hama, his horse is old and slow, which that they established pretty early on, so it's not one of these moments, like random moments where all of a sudden he's falling behind. Like they set that up pretty well. So basically, like he falls behind and kind of decides, like, all right, I'll make a brave last stand to let them get away. Cool scene. I still take a little bit of an issue with this, just because I feel like even though they didn't have a whole lot of people riding with them and fleeing from Edoras, there should have been at least a couple of like guards or soldiers that noticed Hama falling behind. Were like, all right, well, he's a prince, so we gotta stick with him. But anyway, that's more nitpicky. So he we don't see what happens. He kind of pulls his bow back, and he's about to fire off at like Wolf, Targ, and there's like two or three other people like charging after him. So you see him about to release the bow. Don't actually see what happens to Hama or anything like that. So then they arrive at Helm's Deep, and Helm being wounded, they immediately take him to basically like to get healed, get his wounds treated because he's taken like 3 arrows, and just mentally distraught because he just watched one of his sons die in front of him. So pretty dramatic. And soon afterwards is when Wolf shows up. He's got Hama captive, which it doesn't look like Hama managed to take out like everybody but Wolf and Targ, so he at least got to have a cool moment, even though it was off screen. And basically, Wolf, he's kind of like, "Hey, I got your son." And what I like about this scene is, so Targ is kind of advising Wolf, because basically, like once Helm sees his last son alive, he's like, "Look, all right, look, dude, you won. I surrender. Like, take my life instead of my son's. Just you won. Like, what more do you want?" And so Targ's just kind of like, take the offer, dude, because, once they get into Helm's Deep, there's no way we're breaching those walls. And, again, Helm has admitted you won, but Wolf is kind of furthering down his descent to madness, and is just kind of like, nah, I'm just going to kill him because revenge. And so slits his throat and just leaves his body there. So further adding to the mental damage that Helm goes through seeing his other son die right before his eyes within maybe like a few hours of, Haleth. So I like this just because even though Wolf, again, like all the other characters, definitely could have used a little bit more development, I think he is a good villain in the sense of just, he's a good person to hate. Because as the story progresses, you're like, man, I hate this dude, and I very much look forward to seeing him die. And then afterwards, that's when Wolf starts to kind of amass his army outside of Helm's Deep, preparing for the siege. So once Hedda, Helm, and everybody get inside Helm's Deep, they're like, yeah, we're safe, but we're really low on like supplies, and we don't know how long we're going to hold out. And this is kind of when like the despair kind of first starts to set in. And then, of course, it kind of has another like flash forward where basically like unknown amount of time, but like probably a few weeks, maybe even months, where basically like winter's starting to set in, and Helm has basically been unconscious this whole time. And basically the healers mentioned like his body is physically mended, but he's like mentally he's still like not, he's refusing to wake up. And Harris just kind of like understands that he's experienced a lot of trauma because one, he lost a significant battle to Wolf, then he saw Edoras burn, then he's watched both his sons die right before him. So pretty understandable that he'd just be completely out of it and not wanting to wake up and deal with reality. So it kind of focuses more on like the other characters like Hedda and her trying to just keep hope alive. And so this is where like the story's kind of like has a bit of a lull here. Not to say it's bad, but a lot of it's just kind of like building up to the siege and everything. But eventually, like one of the next scenes is outside the Hornburg. We see like some Dunlendings from their perspective, where they're just getting like brutally killed. We don't know people who aren't familiar with the lore don't know by what or by who. But basically, this is another infamous moment with Helm Hammerhand. Is once he kind of takes refuge in the Hornburg, basically at night he blows his horn and just sneaks out and just starts ruthlessly killing Dunlendings with his bare hands. Because basically his whole thought process is, if I don't have a weapon, like they can't do harm to me because I'm unarmed. So basically by hand, he's just slaughtering all these Dunlendings. And I like the fact that like we see this from their perspective, where they don't know what's going on. They just hear this horn blasting during the blizzard and at nighttime, and then a lot of people wake up dead. Now, I would have liked a little, like, had they maybe focused a little bit more on, like, maybe the psychological impact that's having on the Dunlendings. Like, just a little bit more, like, I think maybe had they, like, hung on to this scene or, like, a few more scenes like this. Again, that's just my personal preference. I would have liked a little bit more of, like, again, the psychological aspect of, like, the Dunlendings. But basically, this is when, like, the legend of Helm Hammerhand really cements itself, because, again, this dude goes out in the middle of the night, barehanded, and just starts killing people. And so the Dunlendings are terrified. They start to make up stories that, like, he's a wraith, he's a ghost, he's a monster, all those sorts of stuff. But no one knows, like, how he's getting out there. Like, even the people stuck at, the Hornburg are like, we don't know how he's getting out. So we come to find out that there's a secret passage that Hera eventually discovers one night. And basically, once she kind of follows this passage, it leads out to, like, this open area. And so here's another one of those scenes that, like, a lot of people have kind of complained about, saying that it's fan servicey. And yes, it is, because basically it's these two orcs kind of, like, rummaging through, like, some of the dead bodies, and they're hunting for rings. And one of them says, I don't know what Mordor wants with rings. Now, one thing that I like about the scene is, so both of those orcs are voiced by Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd, so who played Merry and Pippin respectively in The Lord of the Rings. So another kind of way of just connective tissue. And yes, it's fan service, however, in the context of, like, the time frame and everything, to me it makes sense that, like, there would be orcs or other servants of Sauron looking for the ring, because the ring was lost in the Vales of Anduin, so still within this vicinity, because it's not too terribly, like, the Anduin River is too terribly far from Helm's Deep. And again, like, that's just the last place that, like, Sauron or anybody knew that the ring was. It's, when Isildur died, the ring fell off of him, and it's just somewhere in the Vales of the Anduin, like, or in the bottom of the river. So it stands to reason that someone could have easily just been fishing, like Smeagol, and come across it, and then was like, oh, hey, this is a nice little trinket, like what I have here. I don't know if the camera can really pick up. It's my replica of the One Ring. But anywho, so to me that made sense that, like, Sauron, because even in The Lord of the Rings, once Sauron had kind of started to devise his own plans of getting the ring, he was basically sending out servants of his own to basically investigate that entire region as well. So that didn't really bother me. It didn't take me out of the movie, where, again, these two orcs are looking for rings. Because, why wouldn't Sauron have his servants looking for rings of any kind to bring back, so that way he could finally find the One Ring? So eventually the orcs kind of sniff out Hera, because they're like, oh, hey, I smell fresh blood. So she kind of runs away, and then immediately runs into a snow troll, this giant, horrifying snow troll. So things are looking pretty bleak for her until Helm, like, leaps from a ledge, crushes the two orcs, and then just goes toe-to-toe with a snow troll. Another thing that I really like is love how Helm is represented, because, again, from what little Tolkien wrote about him, dude was a total badass. Like, he didn't take shit from anybody, and again, barehanded, just going into battle. So the fact that he's going toe-to-toe, and again, the way that I kind of interpreted this, where, like, why Helm kind of goes out in the middle of the night, is probably because, again, he is not in a very mentally sound state. So this is probably just him in a bit of a crazed state, taking out his frustration and anger on anything he can get his hands on. So he's just in a blind rage, like, again, soloing the snow troll, and it's a pretty cool fight. Yes, is it a little over the top? Absolutely. But it's anime, so that's something to expect, is some over-the-top elements. But anyway, so a cool fight with him and that snow troll. And then eventually, like, once the snow troll's defeated, Helm kind of recognizes Hera, and he's like, alright, hey, so yeah, I've not been all there lately, but hey, we gotta get inside. It's freezing, and there's only one way to get inside, which is basically the gates. So as they're making their way back to the gates into the Hornburg, that's when they're spotted by some of Wolf and his men. So of course they're just kind of like, Helm, get him! So he thankfully is able to get Hera inside, but basically, kind of, there's not enough room. They're not able to open the gates because they're kind of like frosted over. So she's barely able to squeeze through, and that's when Helm's just kind of like, you got this, girl. I'm going to go kill some people. And then it is kind of a nice moment where he basically tells her that, like, he should have believed in her, and that, he kind of realizes that he was blind to his arrogance, which it kind of goes with, like, a lot of Tolkien's themes of, trying to be very humble, trying not to be arrogant, given to like hubris and stuff like that. But I do think that this movie could have done a little bit more with like that message of, not being blindly arrogant like Wolf is, or Helm and stuff like that. But again, minor nitpicks. So then, probably one of my favorite scenes after this is once he closes the gates back up. All these Dunlendings are chasing after, or just running up the ramparts, but the causeway up to Helm, and he's just swatting people down left and right because he's a badass. And is basically, even as he's punching people down, it's just kind of like, this is all you get? Come at me. I think is one, him intentionally trying to antagonize Wolf because they're within eye shot of each other, but also to intimidate the other Dunlendings, because he's kind of, again, he's literally beating people down left and right. They're armed, and he's just bare-fisted, just knocking them down. He's kind of like, come on, this is the best you got? So probably one of the best scenes where he's just, again, kicking a lot of ass, and afterwards, the following morning is when Helm dies, because basically he froze. And again, that's in the lore, is basically one of the nights when Helm went out to go kill some Dunlendings, he froze to death. But he froze upright, and none of the Dunlendings didn't want to go near him or touch his body, because they're like, pass. That dude's probably a ghost. No thanks. And again, this is one of those things where I understand why they didn't want to have Helm be the main character, because I don't know. I feel like I understand like they wanted to have a more happier ending rather than have Helm be the main character and then he dies, towards the end of the movie, kind of end on like a bit of a bittersweet moment where like, yeah, the Rohirrim end up winning the war, but the main character dies. So I get that, and I think Hera is not a bad character to kind of see everything, the series of events, through her eyes. So again, I had no problem with that. Then of course, shortly after that, that's when Wolf finishes his siege tower, because he's kind of been working on that for a while to basically work their way inside the Hornburg. And so basically Hera's just kind of like, hey, I got a plan. It's not a good one, but hear me out. So she developed a relationship with some of the Eagles pretty early on, and basically has one of the Eagles. She climbs up like this cliff face behind Helm's Deep, and basically convinces the Eagle to take Helm's armor and his hammer to Dunharrow, which is where Freylof is at, to ask for help. So again, definitely one of those contrived moments. This one maybe takes... I'm not going to say completely took me out of the movie, but it's definitely one of those more, like, blatant contrived moments where I feel like they could have figured out a better way to resolve this, but anywho. So the Eagle flies off, delivers the armor and stuff like that to Dunharrow. The oddly designed siege tower, because it's really not much of a siege tower, because basically they build it super tall out of arrow range, but then it just kind of like drops down and forms a bridge, which I feel like realistically it's made of wood, so as soon as it fell down on the walls, it would just come crumbling down. But again, movie and / anime logic, so another one of those things from like, well, that seems a very poorly conceived idea, but whatever. So basically, Hera's trying to like evacuate Helm's Deep because they go through the secret passage that she discovered, and I'm pretty sure this is the secret passage that is mentioned in the Two Towers. Basically, like right before the Uruk-hai break through, like the keep of the Hornburg, before Theoden leads his kind of last desperate charge against the Uruk-hai at the end of the movie. So I believe this is the secret passage that they mentioned that leads into the mountains. So basically, once the people are evacuated, her whole plan is to distract Wolf, challenges him to single combat, and so she ends up beating Wolf, and again, it's one of those things where like I've seen some people complain about this, and not to say that it's invalid, but one is, so in the flashback we see of them as kids, Hera does manage to beat Wolf. And to me, the way I kind of saw this is the different fighting styles. So Wolf is fighting a bit more like just wildly like swinging his sword, hacking and slashing away, whereas Hera, though not a skilled warrior, she's fighting a little bit more like she's being more pragmatic and smart about it. So even though I would say Wolf is a better fighter, he's kind of given into like blind rage during this duel, and that's why Hera's able to beat him. Or at least that's kind of how I interpreted that scene. I'm sure a lot of other people disagree and say she's a Mary Sue or whatever, girl boss. Totally fine, but that's kind of just my personal opinion on like how I saw that fight. And so then, of course, that's when, because she challenged him to single combat and was like, hey, if you win, I'm yours, Helm's Deep yours, do whatever you want, but if I win, you gotta, fall back and go away. So, of course, Wolf loses, and, once he loses, Targ kind of, which I like Targ, he's one of those kind of supporting characters that, again, didn't get a whole lot, but there was enough there to where, again, even though he was an antagonist, he was at least a relatively honorable guy. Because after Wolf loses, he's like, hey, look, man, you lost, gotta keep your promise, and also, we've already lost so many people, during this siege. If we, continue this, we're gonna lose even more people, but, you've already won. There is no male heirs left, Helm's line is gone, you're a king, what more do you want? And then Wolf, still, pretty crazy at this moment, decides he's had enough Targ and his good advice, and stabs the dude, and then tries to kill Hera again. And then, of course, that's when Freyalaf arrives. Very similar moment to when Eomer and Gandalf arrive to kind of save the day at Helm's Deep. And so, they kind of storm down the hill and crash into the enemy ranks, and day is saved. But one thing that I do like about the kind of last fight with Hera and Wolf is, and I guess one thing that I don't mind the change, because in the lore, Freyalf doesn't show up at Helm's Deep, but at Edoras, and basically challenges Wolf and kills him, because I think he stabs him through the heart. So in this, Hera is the one that kills Wolf, but what I like about this change, not to say that I think it's better or anything like that, but I don't mind this change. And one thing that I like about it is, so instead of fighting for Rohan out of vengeance, like Freyalf does, very understandable vengeance, she does it out of defense, because she basically kills him with a shield, this old kind of battered Shield Maiden shield. And so she beats him out of, defense. So that's one thing that I kind of liked about this character, even though I think one of my kind of biggest nitpicks and criticism about this movie is there's not a whole lot of character development. When the characters are introduced, they kind of just they're at that same level. There's a little bit of mini arcs that they kind of go through, but for the most part, they all stay relatively the same. And again, I would have liked a little bit more development and a little bit more screen time with some of these characters. But anyways, so I don't mind that. I'm sure a lot of people will probably hate that because the lore changed and all that stuff. But personally, it didn't bother me. And so basically, once Freyalf arrives, Wolf is defeated. I also like that Hera basically tells Freyalf, it's like, hey, look, don't kill all the Dunlendings. They're fleeing. Just let them go. Let's now rule with mercy instead of with vengeance. Enough blood's been shed. And so I like that, because again, that's kind of going with a lot of Tolkien's themes. So, and again, Freyalf is a bit more level-headed than, Helm, so he's kind of yeah, cool, I'm totally fine with that, yeah. For now on, we'll roll with, being very just, and not just, needlessly, mowing people down just because, we can. Then flash forward a little bit, they're rebuilding Edoras, and Freyalf is sitting on the throne, now crowned king, which Freyalf, once he takes over, starts the second line of kings of Rohan. Because Helm was the last descendant of the first line of kings. And a nice, again, it's another fan servicey moment, so basically Saruman shows up, and yes, it's fan service, but it makes sense because, again, in the text, Saruman does show up shortly after this, because he had just returned from the east, and this is when he takes up residence in Isengard. And it makes sense that, the Rohirrim would be like, okay, yeah, cool. I'm fine with having an ally kind of, guard the west and hold up in Isengard. And also I like the fact that they, it's Christopher Lee voicing, it's, I think he only says a few lines, But it is Christopher Lee that they took audio from, I'm assuming, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy 1. And Christopher Lee, I believe it was his wife that gave permission to use his voice. So it was cool getting to see or hear Christopher Lee's voice again as Saruman. And again, yes, fan servicey, but it makes sense in the context of the movie and the lore. Then of course, Hera's kind of like, "Hey, pal, congratulations on being king. You're better fitted than I am. I never really wanted it, so I'm gonna go off now." So apparently, she was summoned by Gandalf to kind of disclose to him what she learned about orcs and them hunting for rings. And that more or less wraps up the movie. So, overall, I definitely enjoyed the movie. I think it's pretty good. And kind of like what I said, my biggest kind of complaints and criticism with this movie is, one, I definitely didn't get enough with the characters, like with the development and stuff like that. And even though it is a little long, I still would hope that there's some kind of extended cut to maybe... I don't imagine we'll get a whole lot like character moments, but maybe a little bit more like action sequences, because another criticism is for a movie called War of the Rohirrim, not a whole lot of war involved. And I really love the style of the animation, because I'm also a big anime fan, and also just in general, like, the animation is gorgeous, or the style. Now, the animation itself can be a little choppy at times, and it's unfortunate because this movie was apparently rushed into production, so that way Warner Brothers could retain the rights. So, I think that's probably where some of the shortcomings come with this movie, and maybe why I'm a little bit more forgiving of some of its flaws. However, this is also where I'm a bit more optimistic going forward with future Warner Brothers Lord of the Rings movies. So if this is the end product of or end result of a rush product, with Hunt for Gollum being the next official project coming out, they'll have a little bit more time. So it's like that, and they're also again kind of working with very little text to go off of with the Hunt for Gollum, much like with War of the Rohirrim. So with a little bit more time, I'm really hoping that they'll really dig deep into, fleshing out some of the characters and the story and stuff like that, and do a good job of it. So, yes, even though War of the Rohirrim, like I said, it's not as good as Lord of the Rings, nothing will ever be that good. Again, unless someone finds a way to adapt the Silmarillion properly. That's the only thing that can ever rival the Lord of the Rings. And I would love that so much for that to happen. But, now whether... I think I'd still have to rewatch this movie and sit on it a little bit more before I can kind of say whether I like it more than the Hobbit movies. Obviously, it's better than Rings of Power, because that show, cannot stress enough at how bad that show is. Not only as a Tolkien adaptation, just as a show in general, it's bad. But again, this movie, I think, is a step in the right direction, and it truly does give me a lot of optimism going forward, even though it does have its flaws. Again, for me, taking things into consideration that this was rushed into production, it turned out pretty good, and again, if this is rush production and it turned out of this quality, then again, I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do taking their time. So... that's where I stand right now. My opinions might change, as I kind of rewatch it, or, have a little bit more time to sit with this movie. But as of now, just watched it last night, so these are my overall thoughts as of now. Still pretty fresh in my mind. May release a video later on if I start to kind of change my mind, whether I'm more positive, more negative. I might go maybe a little bit more in depth with, some of my criticisms, but that more or less wraps up my... fairly lengthy review. Hopefully you all have enjoyed, and let me know what you thought about the movie. Did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? Are you like me? You're a bit more optimistic about future Warner Brothers movies, or are you the opposite, where you didn't like this movie and now you're just as concerned as I don't know, with new movies coming out, and you just wish that they had left it at Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But until next time, everyone, cheers.